Hey everyone, and welcome to Terror Tea. I'm your host Tara, and today we are going to be talking about MTV's Fear. I really wanted to talk about one of my favorite childhood shows. This year is the 20th anniversary. It premiered on September 10th, 2000, and when it was actually canceled by MTV, it was their second highest show and has a bit of a cult following by those who have seen it. So today we're going to go over episodes, we're going to go over rumors, fun facts, and yes, I will be spoiling most of this show for you if you haven't seen it. So let's kick back and do a little bit of reminiscing. Hey guys, and now a quick word from our sponsor, and today's sponsor is Anchor. Anchor is how you're hearing this podcast today. It was created from an app on your phone, or it could be on your computer. It is a free tool that you can use to record, edit, everything. They will distribute the podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many other options. You can make money from your podcast by getting it monetized. Everything you need in one place, in the app Anchor. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. For those of you that don't know, Fear is a reality game show with 5 or more people led into a haunted location. And when I say led, I mean they are blindfolded and have to put their hands on each other's shoulders and literally lead each other into these locations. They sleep and live there in their safe houses during the day, but at night they go in and have to complete these dares. A lot of dares involve them being left alone in scary places in the dark, sometimes for extended periods of time, and sometimes while completing other tasks such as trying to talk to the dead. If you complete all of your dares and survive your time there, you would walk away with $5,000. Each contestant has cameras strapped to them and walkie-talkies so they can communicate with the rest of the team. The safe house also has a computer that would tell them the story of the location, special rooms, and how to get to where they need to go. It really was ahead of its time, and it makes me sad that it only lasted for 2 seasons, but more on that later. Fear started as a pseudo-documentary horror film called Dare, where people would go into a swamp area in Louisiana where spooky things would happen. It was eventually sold to MTV as a TV show. They were a bit hesitant because they were worried a reality-based TV show about ghosts wouldn't be scary enough. In a time where real world and road rules were ruling the MTV airwaves, they had to add a bit of a game show element, thus the $5,000 prize money. Trying to decide how to film this reality show and keep it as scary as possible proved to be interesting. They eventually developed the clam cam that would use the cast as the camera operator. And I remember watching the way the show was filmed was one of the scarier elements of the show. Because if they took off running, you were running with them. You couldn't see what was in front of them, which, according to the cast, was primarily darkness because their lights were so small. You could only see what was behind them. And so you really didn't have that option of looking around. So if they screamed, you would get scared because you have no idea what they're screaming about. Once the Blair Witch Project came out, MTV had a lot more faith in the project, and quite a few locations were then eligible, but a few of them had to have their names changed either for security reasons or requests from the city to not paint their city in a bad light. According to a few interviews with the show creators, they would keep the cast in a hotel room for a few days, and they were only allowed to watch horror movies, some of which were The Shining and Poltergeist. The cast talked about how they were basically ostracized and everyone was kind of cruel to them, and so they pretty much were forced to keep to themselves. And now let's discuss some of the episodes. Episode 1 is at the West Virginia State Penitentiary. This is the location that the showrunners put in their original pitch to MTV. They wanted to test how scary this place was, so they paid a local kid to stay in the basement of the penitentiary for 15 minutes. If he did, they would give him a couple $100. But what he didn't know was they had someone in another room nearby moving a chain along the floor. This scared the kid enough that he wouldn't even stay for $1,000. That's when they knew they had a show. And let me just say, this is a fantastic episode to start the series off of. They have 2 people that are immediately freaking out on like Dare 2. Because they film alone, most of the cast is now scrambling trying to get to these 2 girls because they are both scared and quitting. Christina is quitting because all of the lights went out. She can't see anything on her camera or anything. and Lauren is scared because she has to go into the sugar shack and pull a tarp off of the electric chair. 3 tries later, we finally get Ryan to go in and pull the tarp off. When he tries, the entire electric chair moves towards him. He screams bloody murder and runs out of that room. It is probably one of the most memorable moments of the entire show and is absolutely hilarious. He ended up going back and managed to pull the tarp completely off, still screaming. The sugar shack would have probably been my absolute breaking point, but I don't know. Compared to some of these later episodes, this episode is pretty tame, but hilarious to watch. Episode 2 is St. Agnes's Hospital for the Chronically Ill. The real location is the Fairfield State Hospital in Connecticut. They eventually had to speak to the city commission and rename the location to be able to film here. The crew talks about how off-putting this place was, and the director even got sick there. This area was also known to have cold spots, which would cause equipment to all fail even though they were all on separate power sources. This episode starts off with one of the cast members getting so scared leading into the hospital that she ends up puking with her mask on. The cast has said that at times they would have their eyes covered for a few hours just to keep the atmosphere going. And this episode also features a missing cast member in the hospital that they have to go find. The entire episode took place underground, and our first casualty was Rachel, who quit once she saw a Ouija board was in the room with them and they would be using it on a dare. This episode also features an odd little seance where Jim says he can talk to the spirits. This led to Stephanie leaving. The remaining team members are also offered a bonus dare for an additional $3,000, which they completed. One of the dares was to get inside a cadaver drawer and wait. And I can safely say I don't think I would have been able to do it. I'm very claustrophobic, plus scared of the dark. So that would have been my exit cue for real. Episode 3 is at Dugan Brothers Cement Factory. Their real location is the Ideal Cement Company in Castle Hayne, North Carolina. This episode is extra spooky because it's on Friday the 13th with a full moon. They make multiple references throughout the episode to the blood moon. One of the dares in this episode involves a tarantula staying on Amanda's arm for a full 2 minutes. Absolutely not, no thank you. This is also one of the first episodes I remember thinking that these people really think that MTV is trying to kill them. They had to reenact the suicide of the owner of the factory from the 1980s. All they had to do was put the noose around their neck and shove the concrete block off the ledge. They were all assuming that this would cause the noose to lift and kill him. Jason ended up shoving the cement block off the ledge without the noose on and was disqualified. This episode also had Paul disappearing after completing his dare. They all end up screaming his name, trying to figure out where he's at because they can't get him on the walkie. And then suddenly they get a pop-up on the computer after 2 hours. It turns out he was offered a secret dare and has completed it, so they were never going to see him again. This was super weird to me because we don't ever see what his dare was, and they have never had anything else like this. Abby has to complete a dare where she has to stick her head in a box. She almost quits, and Liz offers her $1,000 if she comes back with her, saying they were in danger. But Abby ends up completing the dare where she has to drop hundreds of cockroaches on her head. Thankfully, the box ended up breaking and only a few fell out. The spider one would have been way too much for me. It would really depend on how freaked out I was already because just watching this scene gave me the heebie-jeebies. Episode 4 is at Hopkins Military Academy. The real location is the Augusta Military Academy. 2 of the cast members would later go on to achieve some other reality TV fame. One is Mercedes, who would be on America's Next Top Model, and the other is Holly, who would be on Big Brother. Holly's first dare is to lay under spikes while a fire burns the support rope. Again, she is one of those that is convinced she is going to die, but she somehow manages to scream her way through it. Angela ends up having to go and make contact with a ghost, and she talks about how she felt like it was in her and kissing her, and she pretty much keeps this up through the entire episode. She later on goes on to explain her experience as being molested by the ghost, according to the cast and crew. Later on, the next dare is to stay in the boiler room without radio contact for however long they tell you. Brian quits after about 40 some odd minutes. Ryan goes next, but he quits an hour and a half in. While Ryan is doing his dare and trying to wait it out, Holly goes again. She has to grab 2 wires from the ceiling and receive an electrical shock for 5 seconds. The best part of this is how she says she hopes nothing is wrong with her because, and I quote, "There better not be anything wrong with me because I have piercings on my body." It was absolutely hilarious. Mercedes ends up finishing the radio silence dare after staying there for 2 hours. The girls make it all the way to the end and win the money. The 2-hour wait in radio silence sounds terrible, but all in all, this was a pretty great episode with some pretty wild dares. Episode 5 is Camp Spirit Lake. The real location is Camp Nobi Bosco, very hard to say, in Hardwick Township, New Jersey. This location is the real-life filming location for the original Friday the 13th film. And of course, knowing that, I had high hopes for this episode, and I will say it is probably my least favorite episode of the entire series. The whole episode starts off immediately talking about cults. So Jen has to go in and chop the head off of a chicken after reading some chants. You have Chris who has to go in a cabin and stick his head in a box full of rats. Jen has to prick her finger and put blood in a pentagram that Javier retraced. And Chris has to get into a coffin in the ground, and later Cece has to cover the coffin with the dirt. I feel like this place was not actually haunted, and so they had to go pretty hard in the cult stuff, and I was just so disappointed with this episode as a kid, and even more so rewatching it. I mean, you've got the filming location of Friday the 13th, and you're doing all this cult stuff. I mean, I get why they can't have Jason walking around all of his glory, because it would obviously ruin the integrity of the show, but all in all, this is my least favorite episode. Episode 6 is Buck Hill End in Buck Hill Falls, Pennsylvania. It starts off with Jennifer being required to measure paranormal activity for 10 minutes in radio silence. With about a minute left in her dare, she decides to quit. Amy also decides to quit before the next dare. Michael's dare is where he has to kneel where someone had been murdered and not turn around. That would have been so hard for me to do. Your mind plays so many tricks on you, and for something like that, there's just no way I feel like I could ever do that. Heidi ends up having to perform an exorcism and is freaking out before they even get there. She ends up quitting and Jesse has to finish it. Poor Michael has another rough dare where he has to go into the bathroom and cannot open the shower curtain until the end. The whole thing leading up to this dare has the weirdest pep talk from Jesse. He's like yelling in, because he's the navigator, in the walkie-talkie, "They're stepping on your roses and pissing on your daisies, man." And he literally says it like that. I'm just like, what does that even mean? Everyone else finishes this episode, and all in all, it was an okay episode. It was not the best episode leading off of this Camp Spirit Lake episode, which was not good at all. So it was kind of a episode for me. Episode 7 is where we're going to start getting super detailed in the episodes, because they do get better and better from here on out. Episode 7 is the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This episode has always had a lot of hype around it for being very scary. The crew even said that they had quite a few spooky things happen to them while they were trying to get everything set up for this episode. One crew member fell down a flight of stairs and said something pushed him down them. The show's resident psychic, Carla Barton, had something follow her back to her hotel room. And to protect the integrity of the show, the cast and crews, like friends and family, were not allowed to know exactly where they were. That way you didn't have anyone coming on site and messing up the show. So she had someone call her hotel room and ask for her when no one knew she was there, and it was not the cast or crew pranking her. She also had a moment where someone knocked on her door and said it was housekeeping, and when she opened the door, there was no one out there, and she was in the middle of a very long hallway full of rooms. The episode starts right off by strapping Irina and Mark into torture devices and then leaving them until Mark has completed his dare and can get Irina out. Next, Jolene is told she has to stay the night and the next day alone in a cell block. Sharif has to end up finishing the dare, and he does, and spends 18 hours alone. Lorena has to complete spirit writing, and she ends up quitting. Ricky completes her dare, and when he finishes, he tries to leave and cannot get out. He asks the team to come and find him and get him, and they have to wait until they get a message on the computer to be able to release him. This one ends with the team walking up to a body bag and having to open it. Of course, they are all dreading it and freaking out, but it ends up just being their money. This episode's pretty great, and there's no way I could spend 18 hours alone in this spooky place. Episode 8 is the USS Hornet. I will let you know right off the bat that I somehow missed this episode as a kid, and so when I was able to go back and rewatch it, it was as if I had never seen this episode and I finally had a brand new episode of Fear, so it was totally awesome for me. This is in a ship, of course, and it starts right off the bat with some really creepy documentaries, and a girl quits right away. Monica is supposed to go and sit in front of a thermal imaging camera in the mess hall and can't do it. It really shows you how unnerving these opening documentaries are. So then Athena has to complete the mission, and her and the Navigator are arguing right off the bat. She finally makes it, and they can see these weird things behind her on the monitor, because depending on where they go, like if they're in front of that thermal imaging camera, the rest of the cast can see that camera. So they're telling her, say that you rebuke this spirit in the name of the Lord and all this stuff. Well, suddenly her mouth starts bleeding. So when she comes back, they think, oh, she's like bit her tongue or bit her cheek. And so she comes back, she has blood all over her mouth, like on the side. And she opens her mouth real wide, and they're all checking it out. And they realize her mouth just started bleeding, and they don't know why. So Matt and Tyree are next. They have to go into the mess hall and get EMF readings, and when they do, the rest of the cast sees these weird orbs on the screen. Once Matt gets back from the mess hall, he quits. The next day starts, and they watch more footage. Athena is told she has 60 seconds to start her dare. Before she leaves, she's already saying she wants to quit. She has to go and turn off her radio and go all the way down in the brig. She quits immediately. Doom ends up having to complete her dare and lock himself in a cell, and they all do a quick group prayer before he leaves. Melanie is a self-proclaimed medium, and her dare is to go into an officer's room and channel the spirit of the Admiral in radio silence. This whole scene is super creepy because she is talking to the spirit and nodding her head in this really weird way, and it's like she's having a conversation that we can't see the other side of. She said that the spirits are guiding her and telling her she has to go over to the sink. When she goes to the sink, she finds a key, and she ends up making her way all the way to the brig where Doom is and unlocks him. That is when radio silence ends, and Tyree tells her is that she has to now go to the brig and unlock Doom. They don't really touch on the fact that she did that all by herself, other than the show putting a note saying that she is a medium, self-proclaimed, yada yada yada. So the final dare is that Tyree has to go into the sickbay, put on a dead soldier's uniform, and lay on the operating table to invoke the spirit until he is notified by the website. Tyree wants to quit, but everyone ends up talking him into it. The dares are all completed, and they win the money. I really liked this episode. The location was great, it was super creepy, and the documentary that they had them listen to was also very unnerving. I absolutely enjoyed this episode. Episode 9 is Fort Gaines in Alabama. This episode pretty much started right off the gate with the dares being super wild and people quitting. One of the girls, Leslie, has to go and stand in this cistern, and she stops answering everybody. And they keep trying to get a hold of her. Well, she starts closing her eyes and she's rocking back and forth. It's super creepy. When she finally answers, she comes back and quits. So Tara has to go and complete this dare instead. Melissa has to crawl in a collapsed tunnel all the way in the pack, and then tries to awaken spirits with Kachina dolls. She also has to stay in radio silence for 3 hours in this super, tight tunnel that is collapsed, mind you, and there is absolutely no way I would have done this. It would not happen. Melissa doesn't do it either, and so Tommy has to go in and do the dare. Donald on his dare has to handcuff himself to an anvil, and when Tommy has to go get him for his dare, they can't get the handcuffs off of him, so they end up breaking the handcuffs with a metal crowbar. Donald then has to go and put himself in a water torture device until someone comes and gets him. Tara has to go into a POW cell during her dare and lock herself into a stock until Donald is sent to come and get her. Then he has to go into the infirmary and put a leech on his arm, which was super disgusting to watch. I absolutely hated that scene. This whole episode started off strong, but once you had them breaking the handcuffs, everything just kind of trickled down, and so it kind of slowed down, and it was a kind of boring rewatch at the end. Episode 10 is the season 1 finale and is at the Laguerre Plantation. The real location is the Desert Plantation in Louisiana. This episode starts right off showing the cast met with a voodoo priestess, and she is telling them that if they feel they are in any sort of danger, that they need to get out. The dares start with Sunshine going into a cabin with a voodoo altar. While on her way there, her light goes out completely and she starts fighting with the navigator and the rest of the team while trying to find her way. She has to kneel before the altar, cut off some of her hair, and state her 3 biggest fears. She is then left there in radio silence. Jennifer has to go into the house and eat flesh off of the pig's feet and smear symbolic blood on her face and neck. Jennifer completely freaks out, but she still does it, and that is a big note from me, man. I'm not doing that if I'm in their shoes. Rachel ends up having to dig up a zombie grave. Yes, you heard that right. A zombie grave, and search for remains. Sunshine has to go into Kitty's cabin and burn a box of deer meat, leave her back to the door in radio silence for 3 hours, and then rub ashes on her face. Jennifer has to go into the master bedroom and lay on the bed in radio silence. And this is the bedroom where one of the women was raped, and it just felt really creepy and very inappropriate, and I was not a big fan of this dare. As soon as Sunshine gets back, she literally sits down and they're like, no, you have 60 seconds to leave. She has to take the zombie potion to the cemetery. She gets lost on her way there, and the show tells, there's a little notation that says she is only 20 feet from the dare location, but she is freaking out and was constantly argumentative with her navigator, so they have to send Rachel to go get her. So Sunshine quits, and Jeremy has to finish the dare that she couldn't. He has to remove a brick from the grave, drink the potion, and then lay on the grave with the brick on his chest in radio silence. Finally, Darren has to take a bag to Kitty's grave. In the bag is a snake that he has to remove and use to perform a chanting ritual, and there's no way I would have done this. He gets so upset and is begging them to come get him, and they eventually calm him down enough to where he does the ritual. All in all, this was an interesting finale. It was completely insane to see them all arguing as much as they were, and it made me wonder how many times people got lost on their way to dares. I did read where they were talking about the crew saying they had to be careful with some of these locations that were older buildings because the floors were not trustworthy. And so, how particular was the route? Did people end up veering off where they shouldn't, and how did you steer them back? And this episode gave me a lot of questions that I really want answered. The season 2 opener is pretty infamous for being the only location where the entire team quit and they had to bring in a new team. So both episode 1 and 2 are located in Mina dos Estrellas. This episode starts off with an Aztec shaman telling them that they all need to die and change in order to find the energy that they need. They're having this whole meeting in broad daylight, but I am still just absolutely not cool with that. I could not imagine going on to this and having this meeting and then being like, cool, let me stay overnight in this place. The first dare that we see is Jose, who has to go into the chapel, knock over the cross, and try to bring out the Nual, which is a creature that can shapeshift and manipulate nature. He ends up completing his dare, no big deal. Natasha and Sandy have to go into the oven room. Sandy has to stay there while Natasha goes across a bridge that's over the river into a path that leads to the hospital. Natasha cannot even make it to the hospital and heads back to Sandy, who's been hearing weird noises. They both quit. Jose and Dave head out, with Dave staying in the oven room. Jose opens his bag and gets covered in blood. He quits immediately while Dave stays in the oven room. Zach goes to replace Jose, and he gets to the hospital and nails a cow tongue to the entrance. The power on the safe house goes out during all of this, leaving Victoria in darkness. She said she can hear something outside of the safe house, and Zach and Dave hear things too. Dave puts a kidney on the hook in the oven room, and then they're good to go. Before the next dare, they have these little white orbs that start showing up around the safe house that's not visible to the naked eye. Victoria and Zach have to go into the carpinteria and use night vision. Once Victoria gets out of the safe house, she cannot continue and quits. Zach says he cannot go back and asks Dave if he wants to leave with him. Zach ends up heading out with Dave coaching him, but when it comes to the stairs, he cannot go down and has to quit. Dave has an envelope with printed instructions, and he debates on whether or not he wants to continue as well, but he ultimately decides to quit, meaning that the entire team has quit and not completed all of their dares. Episode 2 starts off with a brief recap of everything that has happened, and we learn more about the new wall. The previous team also recorded final videos to tell the new team what to expect. I absolutely loved this. I'm a big fan of the whole documentary feature to really set the mood for this, and so adding in the team that all quit together to then tell their side, I thought was a brilliant touch. So the first dare is to finish the original dare from the previous episode. Major and Tiffany have to go into the carpinteria. Tiffany waits outside while Major keeps going. He has to scan the room with a night scope, and while he's in there, he sees a cat-like creature. Brandon then has to go into the oven room and climb down into the smokestack and sit in radio silence for 3 hours. He ended up having some sort of flashlight that went out, and so they end up having to drop down a handheld camera with a light on it for him to even be able to see. Raquel has to go into the oven room on her dare and then remove the rope ladder that Brandon used to climb out. The cow tongue from the previous team is still hanging, and Raquel's dare is to wrap gauze around her eyes and wait for the new wall to appear. She wraps her face, and at the 2 hours of radio silence, Brandon starts hearing strange noises, and the doors to the smokestack above him slam shut. Brandon breaks radio silence, and after a little bit of debate, the team have to end up letting him know that he is disqualified and trapped. When his other light goes out, Raquel ends up saying that she's quitting too, and she goes to get him out and help him. When they all talk about quitting, the rest of the team is talking about doing it, and Tiffany quits as well. The computer tells them that there is an error in the observation camera that was detected, and that dare will remain permanently incomplete. Jason and Major have to go into the drainage pit. Major has to lower himself into the pit as bait and wait while Jason takes his ladder and returns to the safe house. Major has to empty a jar of blood into the pit and record his experiences. They were both terrified because while all this is going on, they kept hearing wolves and other sounds. Addie has to take a chicken to the Modeo room and take a picture of the new wall. She has to try to provoke it by yelling that she doesn't believe in it or respect it. Finally, Jason has to go back to the drainage pit and get Major out. Major has been screaming and crying the entire time, and it was really unnerving at times because he was crying for his mom and just seemed genuinely hysterical the longer he was in there. The whole team was like, we've got to get him out, he's crying, he's really upset. It was a really kind of emotional thing to watch. Now, later on in an interview, Major said that the hysterics were for more TV time and that he was not at all afraid or worried, but it was a freaky experience. I don't know if I believe that because he seemed genuinely terrified. Episode 3 is at the Hacienda Tabby. It starts off with Jen having to go into the cistern and climb down a rope ladder and wait for 5 hours in radio silence. Tom is now headed to do his task, and they're trying to talk him into doing it because he's debating on quitting, because Jen is now also freaking out and she has decided that she is going to quit. And she is screaming that someone is going to have to come get her and all of this, so they end up sending Tom. So Tom goes and gets her. She goes back to the safe house and quits. Then he has to complete his dare. So he has to go inside the hacienda and place 3 pig heads on poles and light lanterns to try to draw out the spirits. Someone then had to volunteer to do Jen's dare, and after a little bit of debating, Mario finally agrees to do it. Raven has to go into a pool to perform a seance, and while she's getting ready to start, she ends up having a panic attack and quits. Justin goes to the cistern to let Mario out, and night 1 is over. As they're getting ready to finish up, one of them says, "We're just supposed to go to sleep now?" And I completely understood that mentality because I do not understand how they are sleeping in some of these places. So night 2 starts, and Stephanie has to complete Raven's dare with the seance, and her questions cracked me up because they were just very kind of graphic. Were you brutally murdered was the one that really caught my attention. I was just like, why are you asking them that? Do not make them angry. Let's ask them we're not here to disturb you, right? Things like that. Something that in a previous episode in season 1, they were supposed to ask a spirit 2 questions, and he was like, we're not here to hurt you, right? And we're here just to learn. And it was stuff like that. Those are perfect things to ask, not, were you brutally murdered? But whatever. So Justin has to put a hood thing over his head and be led to the stables by Tom. He then has to have Justin climb in a hole, and Tom has to bury him up to his neck. Tom then has his own dare where he has to go to a fire pit and put a heart on a stake for the spirits and wait in radio silence. Then everyone gets to go back to the safe house, but poor Justin never saw how to get there because he was led with a hood on his face. And so he's trying to ask Mario, the navigator, like, how do I get back? What do I do? And Mario cannot explain to him how to get back. Tom also got very annoyed with Mario's instructions. And while it was very funny to watch them bicker back and forth and just be like, you have to tell me where to go, I can't see. And honestly, this episode was not as good as the others. Now, the other 2 episodes are fantastic, and I think that's part of it because you really can't top those episodes. Episode 4 is at the Key Sugar Mill, which is actually the Haiku Sugar Mill in Hawaii. This location was one that the crews were very scared to set up. Multiple people talked about how creepy it was, and no one wanted to set it up alone. The show starts off with Joe having to go into the machine shop and reenact a suicide by invoking a dead spirit and then waiting in radio silence. Valeska has to go into the storage room, and while waiting she sees something outside and quits. She kept saying that she saw a face with no body. Maria has to complete the dare, but she ends up saying she doesn't want to do it. They have to talk her into doing it multiple times, and once she gets to the red light out in the grounds, she decides that she doesn't want to do it, and she keeps asking them to come get her, but they aren't allowed to go to her. Eventually, she makes it to the safe house on her own, and yes, she does quit. Ira has to now go into the storage room and wait in radio silence. Selena has to go into the irrigation tunnels and take an elevator 1,000 feet down. On the way down, the elevator stops at a solid wall, and she loses radio contact. She eventually gets everything good to go. She makes it out of that elevator, which, you know, good on her for finishing this dare, because I know I never would have. I would have said absolutely not to going into an elevator in some abandoned sugar mill. But anyway, she has to go down into where there's like this water reservoir, and she has to retrieve the objects that were dropped in this stream. Jason has to go into the cane grinder and reenact an accident by laying in the cane grinder with the machine on, but nothing happens. I personally really enjoyed the location on this one, and I thought the dares were super creepy. Episode 5 is the Serenity Lake Sanitarium. Real location is the King Edward VII Sanitarium in Canada. This episode starts off with everyone in different locations and envelopes that will then lead them to the safe house, which is 1 level underground. Heather has to go upstairs to the doctor's bedroom and do auto writing to invoke the spirit of the doctor's wife. April has to go into the children's ward and draw out spirits of the children by rolling balls across the floor. Gabrielle and Creed have to investigate the basement. They find a secret room, and Gabrielle must be locked in the room for 20 hours in radio silence. I would hate this so much, to be locked in there for 20 hours, but this place didn't seem as scary as some of the others, so I really don't know if I would have been able to do it or not. Gabrielle, Heather, and Thomas investigate the welding house. They have a seance to contact a dead soldier, and once that is over, Thomas has to be left behind. They were all terrified during the seance and talked about how they felt possessed. Thomas has a hard time even getting in the building to go upstairs. He makes it inside, but hears something and immediately runs right back outside. They try to get him to stay, but he ends up quitting, and he runs all the way back to the safe house, telling whatever it is that he feels is chasing him to leave him alone. Creed has to complete the dare, which is invoking the Angel of Death by drawing inverted crosses on doors. Creed cracks me up the entire time doing this because he is saying that his credit card debt is making him draw upside down crosses. April is supposed to go into Pigman's attic to investigate, but quits before she can even make it to the attic. Antoine completes the dare by going upstairs and using the UV light to figure out which of the 6 rooms is a supernatural hotspot. He was walking through the attic the entire time apologizing and, oh, I'll be out right out, sorry, and just stuff like that. It was super funny. Sometimes with the long radio silences, I'll forget that these people are even on the show because you don't see them for so long and there are so many dares in between, but honestly, this location didn't seem that scary. And the final episode is the Betker Brewery, which is really the Limp Brewery in St. Louis. Sion has to start everything off by investigating the ballroom, but she ends up quitting soon after she leaves the safe house. Rex ends up completing her dare. He has to go into the ballroom and chant Auto come forth and avenge your death, and then smash the ballroom mirrors. Megan and Scout then have to go and investigate the Great Hall, but once Megan sees Monkey Boy's cage, she quits. Pavon has to complete the dare, and they try to contact the spirit of Monkey Boy using a Ouija board. Mark has to go into the storage vault and shut himself in. At 18 hours, Mark quits just right before Rex was told he was supposed to go and get him. It sucks they couldn't tell him that he was ready to go. He even says that he was probably just minutes away from getting saved. Pavon and Rex go into the Great Hall, and Pavon has to get into the Monkey Boy cage while Rex suspends it in the air. They end up going back and forth a few times over who's going to get in the cage, and the episodes seem to fly by, which really sucked because it was the last one of the series. Now that we've went over the episodes, let's talk about why Fear was canceled. Rumors have swirled over the years, and the big one was that a contestant died during the show and they had to end it. I'm assuming this rumor comes from the fact that Paul disappears at the season 1 episode 3 where he has his secret dare. My whole thing with that is that if Paul really had died, then I doubt they would have ever finished any of the episodes, much less been greenlit for a second season. Of course, you always have my personal favorite that a cast member was possessed, but you would think if someone was possessed, they would use that for good TV. One thing that has been mentioned that has not been specifically like, oh, this is the exact reason, is 9/11. 9/11 did occur in between season 1 and 2, and the crew has talked about in interviews where they didn't want to have someone flipping through the channels and seeing someone running and screaming in the dark, because there were a lot more horrific things going on in the world at that time. The other, more publicized reason would be the cost. Yes, the prize money was only $5,000 per person, but there was a lot more to this show than just the prize money. While in modern times, you could just put a GoPro on people and just let them go to these locations and film, but back then, it was much more tedious. They had to figure out a way to rig everything up. That's where the clam cam design came in, because they didn't know how they were going to rig these cameras up on people. Plus, they have to have crews go in ahead of time and wire these locations, set everything up, plus traveling with the crew and the cast to these locations. Not to mention all the documentary footage that they had to create, and the computer setup. Keep in mind, this is 2000 and 2001. While being the number 2 show for MTV at the time, it wasn't pulling in numbers against heavy hitters for MTV to justify the cost. MTV ended up going to the showrunners and asking for the budget to be cut in half and the documentary to be removed. They told MTV that they couldn't in good faith produce the same quality show for half the budget. They also would not budge on the documentary, and rightfully so. The documentary really sets the mood for the location and enhances some of the truly scary moments of the show. They had expected MTV to give in, but instead they were canceled. And of course, I'd mentioned the rumors of people dying, and people just love to say that, but in actuality, his dare was probably cut. There were many dares that didn't make the show. They stated that if it didn't further the story, or the view wasn't the best because of how the cameras were set up, they would cut it. I personally wish they would release the show in its entirety with behind the scenes and deleted dares. MTV's Fear was a show that was completely unique in its time, and I honestly do not believe it would ever be able to be replicated now. Reality TV is too heavily produced, and I think modern audiences would accuse the show of being too fake or boring if it wasn't full of big jump scares. I would love to see MTV's Fear come back to something like Shudder, where it could maintain its authenticity. What about you guys? Have you seen Fear? Do you love it? Hate it? What are your thoughts? Let me know over at Instagram at terror.t. We are also on Twitter at terror_t. We also have our Facebook group for the pod. Come hang out and let's talk all things horror and terror tea.